With the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X almost here, as with the start of any console generation, manufacturers are eager to show us how the graphics will improve, game worlds will get bigger, gameplay will become more immersive, and how these newfangled systems will be able to make us poached eggs in the morning. But for many, there is a fundamental question that they want answered. Will 60 FPS be normal with this new generation, or are we doomed for the 30 FPS forever? Well, judging by several games that we've seen running, such as at the PlayStation 5 event, 30 FPS certainly doesn't look like it's going anywhere, right? I mean, Ratchet & Clank were running at 30 FPS, and then we've seen Assassin's Creed on the Xbox as well, also touching at just 30 FPS. It's worth noting that that software is certainly not final, and there are still several months to go until we see these games come to store shelves. But my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing the challenges of developers actually hitting 60 FPS and just how realistic it's going to be for both the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X to maintain 60 FPS through a great number of its titles. Because this is YouTube land, if you could drop a like on the video and also subscribe to the channel, that would also be pretty damn spiffy. But with that said, let's jump in. This is a bit of a spoiler for the rest of the video, but in my opinion, while 60 FPS is going to be a lot more achievable with the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5, not least of which because of the CPUs in these next-gen machines are way more capable than what we saw with the previous generation, I still feel it's going to be largely down to developers on how they choose to utilize the resources of these next-generation consoles. Just so that we're all on the same page, frame rate is the number of new images, or frames if you prefer, that are displayed on screen within a space of 1 second. Generally for video games, a minimum number of 30 is achieved, but higher is preferable, especially with gamers. I don't wish to delve too much into the world of TVs and refresh rates, because this video is already going to be fairly lengthy as is, but a fundamental understanding of how this all comes together will benefit us for this video, so we'll go into it briefly. Console games generally run at frame rates of either 30 or 60 FPS, and TVs in most homes now hit 60 FPS as the highest refresh rate, but higher refresh rate and variable refresh rate panels are becoming more common in higher-end TVs, although often they are considerably more expensive. Compare that to PC gamers who have for years now had access to 60 FPS or higher gameplay, with old-school CRTs often meaning that Quake and Counter-Strike players would aim for a minimum of 75 Hz, often, realistically, shooting for far higher. In modern days, variable refresh rate panels can be 120, 144, 165 Hz or even higher, such as 240. Again, keeping things as simple as possible, there are many elements to the latency of gameplay, i.e. how long it takes for a button to register, for us to perceive an action that we're performing on the controller to actually take place in the game. I guess in many ways you could almost think of it as looking at a moment in time that's already passed. Microsoft's Xbox Series X, for example, does support variable refresh rates up to 120 Hz, and even the controller has been optimized for reduction in latency from you pressing the, say, jump button and your character momentarily conquering gravity. A common problem for older displays was the higher refresh rate associated from being sent a new frame and spitting it out on screen. The world of technology is vast, and while your modern day TV display a standard of 60 Hz, and as I mentioned a moment ago, some screens can go higher, such as 120, even for say a 65-inch panel, the response time is also a really big deal too, especially with older displays. Response time is essentially the time it takes for the TV to get a new image from the console or GPU of your PC, and then to process it and for it to appear on screen. Again, a highly simplified explanation. The benefits of a higher frame rate are numerous. The first is that higher frame rates visually look better in motion, though going from say 60 to 120 FPS has a less noticeable benefit than 30 to 60. But perhaps the biggest and most obvious difference in a higher frame rate is the reduction of latency, especially from when controlling the game. Higher frame rates means there's less of a delay from the happenings in a game world versus what's being displayed on screen, and this has a direct impact into how you control the game. The latency between pressing a button and the action taking place. Microsoft is pushing this heavily for the Xbox Series X even on their controllers, touting the benefits of DLI or dynamic latency input. Higher frame rates are especially desirable for an online competitive title, as Nvidia's own research has found that going from 60 to 120 FPS in an online game improves players' performance by around 60%. And while in a single player game you're not as competitive compared to, say, an online match of Call of Duty, 60 FPS does improve the fluidity of the experience itself, and again, the game just feels tighter to control. Alright, so now we've talked about why a higher FPS is great, why on earth are these newfangled consoles not a surefire bet to lock 60 FPS across the board? The more frames, though, that you're trying to render per second, the less time the system itself has to spit out a new one. This can be measured in the number of milliseconds. And you could take into account things such as 1% minimums, but for my sanity and everyone else's, I will just look at this for averages. So, if you want to hit 30 FPS, every 33.3 milliseconds a new frame, image, must be spat out by the console. If you wish to double the frame rate, then you have to halve the amount of time it takes to render that new frame. So now the console only has 16.6 milliseconds. You can easily do the maths yourself. You take 1000, the number of milliseconds in 1 second, and then divide it by the target frames per second. So, for example, 1000 divided by 30 equals 33.33333333. And boom, that's how many FPS on average that you can crank out per second. For those wondering, frame rate dips though occur when the system is just not able to maintain that frame rate, caused by being in, say, a stressful area of the game, so the system now takes longer to render the previous frame. This is one of the reasons, generally, that if you weren't to lock the performance of a console, the actual frame rate of a game would often be over 30 FPS, such as 33, 36 or even higher. So there's a little overhead when things do become overwhelming. For a modern example of this, UE5's Lumen demo was apparently running between 40 and 45 FPS, but Epic have since capped the game demo at just 30 FPS, although according to their recent presentations, they've now gotten the experience to be even higher, up to 60 FPS depending on the ray tracing settings. Higher frame rates provide a smoother visual experience, it's true. Check out this footage here of Shadow of the Tomb Raider, capped at 30 FPS versus 60. There's a distinct difference in how the game feels to control, though some genres do benefit less from the higher frame rate. Action and fast-paced titles are obvious 60 FPS candidates, but games such as a JRPG, well, they're less affected. Here, I've used AI to upsample the PS5 Ratchet & Clank demo, cranking it from 30 FPS, which is what we saw at the PlayStation 5 teaser event, to 60 FPS. You can certainly see the increase in smoothness of the presentation, although you'll have to forgive some of the compression artifacts during the video here, as I've downloaded it and then processed it a few times. And here, we've got the Lumen demo. I took the PS5 Lumen demo and then did much the same thing, interpreting frames from 30 to 65. You can see that the visual presentation is definitely more pleasing. But, as you probably guessed by now, the problem raising the FPS target from 30 to 60 FPS is that the hardware undergoes significantly more work. The higher the frame rate, the more cycles are being eaten up just running the game with high frames, meaning that, generally speaking, you need to have a game render at lower visual quality so that the performance is freed up to maintain the higher frame rate. Firstly, the good news about the consoles is that the CPU inside the next generation consoles are much faster compared to the predecessors. The Jaguar architecture, which formed the basis of the 8-core CPUs inside the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One APUs, just wasn't very powerful, and it was made all the worse by having higher workload placed upon them via data decompression and even handling a lot of the audio processing duties, which again is offloaded for the next generation consoles. This extra CPU grunt should mean that the consoles have way more performance to push out higher frame rates, but this is not a limitless resource. Developers may opt to push for better physics, richer and more detailed world and other uses which eat up the CPU, rather than go for the higher frame rates. What about the SSDs in the next-gen systems? Well, SSDs don't have exactly the same impact as a CPU, which obviously with a CPU it's processing data each and every frame. But the SSDs will be incredibly important for the next generation when it comes to bringing data in, particularly minimizing hiccups and latency and stuttering. If you've played a game on the current generation, you'll know that it's not uncommon to either get really long load times or momentary stutter while data is being streamed in from the mechanical drive. And this can often bring the frame rate down quite considerably in certain titles. I've covered this much more extensively in an SSD investigation video, which I will link in the video description. The PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X also both have radically improved GPUs over their predecessors, but this is not just in terms of raw T-flop measurements either. T-flops from one generation to another are, quite honestly, a terrible performance metric, and PC gamers have known this for a long time. No PC gamer will compare an R9 290X, with its about 5.5-ish to 6 T-flops depending on the model, to an RTX 2060 from Nvidia, which only has about 6.5 T-flops. Despite this relatively small difference in T-flops, the RTX 2060 stomps the R9 290X. Not only is it significantly more powerful in terms of raw frame rate, along with features such as hardware-based ray tracing, but this much newer architecture is more efficient too. Nvidia's RTX 2060 represents low to mid-range on Nvidia's lineup compared to the R9 290X, which was AMD's then current flagship model. But even so, the 2060 is far faster and also puts out way less heat, and the chip itself is far smaller. Let's pick on the Xbox for a moment. The Xbox Series X GPU is said to be about 12 T-flops, which on the face of it isn't that impressive sounding. Compared to the Xbox One X, it's only about twice as fast. But this is ignoring things like the RDNA 2 based architecture. The Xbox Series X delivers massive IPC, instructions per clock, improvements compared to the older architectures. You can see this reflected here with RDNA 1 versus Polaris. This comparison I did pits the two GPUs at the same clocks, and the RX 480 gets destroyed by the 5700, despite the fact that they share the same number of compute units, 36. RDNA 2 is said to deliver a similar leap from RDNA 1, and even if we're conservative about the IPC gains from RDNA 1 to 2, and say they're not as big, which is doubtful given the efficiency claims from AMD, as well as their own statements of IPC, plus before any of this came out, I also reported much of this from my own sources as exclusives. The Xbox Series X simply will do way more work for those 12 T-flops, even if we were to compare this to an imaginary Xbox One X with a 12 T-flop GPU based on its Polaris-ish architecture. But despite the drastic increase in power and efficiency, consoles are not infinite resources, especially as gamers demand higher resolutions. Higher resolutions also increase the demand on the GPU. It's a simple math problem. 1920 by 1080, aka 1080p, is 1/4 the pixel number as 4K.
without tricks and optimizations in efficiency, going from 30 FPS 1080p to 60 4K can eat up 8 times the GPU power, even if we don't have other better visuals such as hardware-based ray tracing. Reality is, though, it's probably not going to be 8 times, as some things scale way better than others, although this is part of a wider topic which I won't really touch on here. Fortunately, technology, though, is able to upsample or reconstruct lower resolution images, and it has already been confirmed by the Xbox Series X GPU, and can render at a lower resolution and then use the same compute units to upsample using AI, similar to how Nvidia's DLSS technology, which I've covered extensively in a previous video, I'll again link in the video description. The difference is, though, Nvidia's DLSS, or Deep Learning Super Sampling, uses tensor cores, and these are separate parts of the chip which handle these operations. With the Xbox Series X, though, these operations are run on the compute unit of the GPU, albeit at a much lower precision, which is a huge performance saving, because multiple of those operations can run concurrently. To my knowledge, RDNA 2 sports similar tech across the board, and indeed one of my exclusives was that RDNA 2 was to improve compute performance over RDNA 1. I also think that PS5 handles things similarly to the Xbox, though the consoles could also use more traditional tech for reconstructing lower resolution images. Even very early in the PS4's life cycle, we saw this with Killzone Shadowfall. With tech such as hardware-based ray tracing and other effects which eat up GPU cycles, developers will need to choose how to leverage the performance of its machine. This is not to say that developers won't push 60 or even 120 FPS for its games. Dirt 5 on the Xbox Series X can hit 120. Fortunately, different modes are easy to implement now, so we could see games run at 1440p or 1600p for a base resolution and then upsampled or just raw outputted at 60, but people who prefer to choose resolution, 30 FPS and 4K could also be an option too.
I suspect that this approach of having flexibility at the frame rate and resolution that games run at will be of paramount importance, especially for Microsoft, who will also be having 2 different SKUs at launch, with the Lockhart, or Xbox Series S as it's probably going to be called, as well as the Xbox Series X. Having Lockhart capable of hitting 1080p 60 FPS or 1440p 30 FPS means that developers will need to make some decisions. Given Lockhart has many of the same essential components as the bigger brother SKU, such as the same CPU with, well, from what we gather anyway, basically an identical CPU configuration like clock frequency, it makes a lot of sense for developers to provide that option for folks to choose what resolution or frame rate they target. I don't know if it will be certainly in all games, but I do suspect it will be more common, not least of which because with the previous generation, one of the things that was holding it back wasn't the GPU performance, but the CPU performance. Basically, even if you ran the game at 720p, the CPU in those machines was so weak, it just couldn't spit out enough frames to hit 60 FPS anyway, which is one of the reasons that quite frequently base consoles versus the Pro consoles didn't really have a frame rate advantage. Maybe a subtle one because, let's say, the PlayStation 4 had 1600 MHz and 2100 MHz for the base and the Pro consoles respectively. There's also a lot of evidence that performance-saving measures are already being investigated by games developers. As I've said several times now, performance even on the next generation is not infinite, and using smart techniques to maximize the performance of the GPUs and CPUs and memory and so on is going to be of critical importance. The fact of the matter is, though, as developers become more familiar with both machines, they're going to be able to squeeze way more out of them, as they're going to be able to understand how to get the most out of the hardware. But that said, in both the Road to PS5 event as well as what we've seen from Microsoft, there is quite a lot of evidence that certain compute-based techniques, for example, are being run at considerably lower than native resolution. For example, hardware-based ray tracing, I wouldn't be surprised if it's being calculated at 1/4 of the rate compared to the rest of the standard rasterization techniques. It's also not very unlikely to me that upsampling is going to be extremely important too, simply because of the requirements for running games at high resolutions. This is, unfortunately, the simple fact of having a console need to fit specific budgets. If you have a console which was, let's say, $1,500 and had a way higher power requirement, so for example it was running like 600-700 watts and was also twice the size, obviously performance metrics can be decided very differently. But when you have a system that has to target $400 to $500 at launch and also needs to only be around 300 watts at the highest when it's drawing power from the wall, plus other constraints too, like what is actually available at the market at specific budget, well, it's not surprising that developers are given certain choices that they need to make. Ultimately, I don't necessarily have a major problem with 30 FPS in all games. With that said, I definitely feel it a lot more in others. Final Fantasy VII, for example, on the PS4 is really difficult for me to play at times at only 30 FPS. And I felt much the same with, for example, Gears when I was playing it on the Xbox One X. I took my Xbox One X around a friend's house and we were kind of playing through the campaign together, and I definitely noticed it versus the PC with the lower frame rate, but obviously you do have the performance mode there, which is actually what I chose to run the game in rather than the higher quality settings. So hopefully giving users the choice will become more prevalent in the next generation, but we can only wait and see. With all of that said, I'm going to remind you once again to click the subscribe button if you've not already done so, and hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.